There's a specific moment most people can recognize when I describe it. Like you did something or you didn't do something you think you should have. And before you can even finish processing what happened, something arrives in your body, like you can feel heavy or tight, and a voice, not always in words, sometimes just a feeling that says, you are responsible for this. You should have known. You should have done something. That is guilt. And almost everyone that I've worked with, regardless of what brought them into therapy, has had this relationship with guilt. Some people carry it quietly, like it's a background noise. Some are actively tormented by it. Some use it as a compass. Some use it as a weapon against themselves. But very few people actually understand what guilt is and where it comes from, what it is doing in your nervous system, what purpose it has, and when it's telling you the truth and when it's lying to you. We will look at guilt, and I'm going to ask you to sit with some uncomfortable ideas that I will share. To understand guilt, we have to place it in the right category because not all emotions are the same kind. Some emotions are what researchers call basic emotions, like fear, anger, sadness, joy. These are fast, automatic, universal across cultures, and they evolved to respond to immediate threats and immediate opportunities. They don't require a lot of cognitive processing. You don't need to think to feel fear when something like jumps at you. Your body responds before your mind catches up. But guilt is something different. Guilt belongs to a category often called self-conscious emotions or moral emotions. What makes these emotions different? So first of all, they require self-awareness. You cannot feel guilt without having a sense of yourself as an agent, someone who acts, who chooses. This is why very young children don't experience guilt in the way we do as adults. The cognitive architecture isn't there yet. Secondly, these emotions require evaluation. So you are holding your behavior up against some standard, moral, social, and you find a gap. Something you did or didn't do falls short of what you believe you should have done. Third, these emotions are social in nature. They exist not just inside you, but in relation to other people. They regulate how we behave in groups, how we maintain bonds, how we repair harm. And guilt is not just a private experience. It's an emotion that evolved to serve a social function. Jonathan Haidt, in his work on moral emotions, identifies guilt as one of the emotions that make us being able to live in a cooperative society. We feel bad when we harm others, and it motivates repair, apology, changes behavior. In its functional form, one of the emotional foundations of morality is actually our ability to experience guilt. In its origin, it's adaptive, and it's not the enemy, it's a signal system. I want to also explain to you the difference between guilt, shame, and embarrassment. These three emotions are constantly confused, and they have very different implications for how you heal, how you relate to others, and how you move through your life. Embarrassment is the most social of the three, and in many ways the most superficial. Embarrassment arises when you violate a social norm, when you do something awkward, inappropriate for the context, or that draws unwanted attention to you, like you trip in public, or you say the wrong thing at the wrong moment, or you realize your shirt is inside out during an important meeting. Embarrassment is fundamentally about audience. You need or imagine some witnesses, and it's acute usually, and it's passing. Your face flushes, you want to disappear, then usually it fades. The relationship to the self is relatively intact. You did something awkward, but you're not in your core sense of yourself a bad person because of it. Embarrassment also tends to carry a kind of lightness over time. In retrospect, embarrassing moments often become funny. And that's actually diagnostic because guilt and shame almost never become funny. Shame is the deepest and, in clinical terms, the most dangerous of these three. Shame is not about what you did. Shame is about what and who you are. When you feel shame, the object of evaluation is not your behavior, it's yourself. The implicit message of shame is I am bad, I am defective, I am fundamentally flawed in a way that makes me unworthy of belonging. Researchers distinguish guilt and shame precisely along this axis. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. This distinction has huge clinical consequences because guilt, when it is proportionate and accurate, actually motivates repair. You want to make it right. You want to apologize. You want to change your behavior. It keeps you in relationship. It orients you outward toward the person you harmed. So shame does the opposite. Shame makes you want to hide, to disappear, to withdraw, and it's isolating. And because it attacks the whole self rather than a specific behavior, there is nothing to repair. You cannot fix what you are. This is why chronic shame is so strongly associated with depression, addiction, narcissistic defenses, relational avoidance, you name it. There's also a paradox in shame. People who feel the most shame often act the least empathetically because shame goes inward, it's self-focused, not other-focused. You're so consumed with the pain of your own defectiveness that you lose access to genuine concern for the other people. Guilt tends to preserve empathy. You're still oriented toward the person you affected. And as I've said, guilt is focused on behavior and not identity. It says something I did or didn't do caused harm or fell short of what I believe I should have done. It is more precise than shame. It has an object and it points toward action. Here's where it gets complicated, and this is what we spend the rest of this video on. Not all guilt is pointing to something real. Not all guilt is calibrated to actual responsibility, and not all guilt is telling you the truth. Same as anxiety, it's lying a lot. Let's talk about rational versus irrational guilt. This is the part I want you to really sit with because I think it changes how you relate to this emotion. There's rational guilt that is proportionate, accurate. It's pointing to something you are genuinely responsible for. You said something cruel to someone you love. You made a choice that had consequences for others, bad consequences. You broke a commitment. You acted in a way that contradicted your own values. In these cases, guilt is functioning correctly. It's telling you this matters, this person matters, what you did matters, and the appropriate response is acknowledgement, repair, and changing your behavior. This kind of guilt is healthy. It is part of moral functioning and it keeps relationships alive. It means you care about other people and you care about the kind of person you want to be. But then there's irrational guilt. It has the same weight, the same internal collapse, the same voice, but it's not pointing to something that you're genuinely responsible for. It is attached to things that were never in your control. They happen to you, things that are the result of other people's choices. A compassionate person will tell you it's not yours to carry, and yet you carry it. So where does this irrational guilt come from? How irrational guilt forms? We don't arrive in the world with a fully calibrated guilt response. We don't have it. It is shaped by our relationships, the messages we receive from people who were raising us, by the emotional atmosphere of the families that we grew up in. Children are fundamentally egocentric in a cognitive developmental way. When you're young, you're the center of your perceived universe. You don't yet have the cognitive capacity to fully understand that other people's emotional states, choices, and actions have causes that have nothing to do with you. So what happens when the parent is depressed or angry or unavailable or chronically overwhelmed? You do not think, my parent is struggling because of their own unresolved trauma and life circumstances, right? You think, something about me caused this, something I did or didn't do. If I can just figure out the right thing to do, the right way to be, I can fix my mom. This is the developmental root of irrational guilt. The child who learns to monitor, to adapt, to take responsibility for the emotional climate in the family and becomes a pattern. A reflexive assumption is if something is wrong, I am probably responsible. Over time, this pattern does not stay in childhood. It moves with you into every relationship, every workplace. It just walks with you, hand in hand. And it is reinforced by certain moral and cultural messages that you should always do more, be more, give more, and it applies to both men and women. And that your needs come last, and if you want to rest, you're lazy or selfish. Guilt is always connected to a belief about what you should do or be. And here's something I want to highlight. Not all moral beliefs are accurate or helpful or even yours. Many of the beliefs that generate chronic guilt were installed before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate them. They were absorbed from caregivers who may have had their own distorted guilt responses, or from religious or cultural systems that used guilt as a tool of control, from relationships in which someone consciously or unconsciously made you responsible for their emotional state. And then these beliefs operate as if they are simply the truth, as if it is objectively true that you should have known better, that you should have done more, that you are responsible for someone else's pain or someone else's choices or well-being. You can feel guilty for things that are not your fault. You can feel guilty for things that were never your responsibility. And that guilt will feel just as real, just as heavy, just as urgent as guilt about something that you actually did. The feeling does not tell you the truth about where the responsibility lies. And one of the things that is consistently striking in trauma work is how often guilt appears not as a reasonable response to something a person actually did, but as an attempt to make sense of something that happened to them. In EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, a well-researched, well-known trauma therapy developed by Francine Shapiro, one of the core clinical tools is the identification of what we call negative cognitions. These are the beliefs about the self that become attached to traumatic memories. They are the meaning the nervous system made of the experience at the time it happened, often when you were young, overwhelmed, and without the resources to process what was happening actually. And what is striking is that there are entire clusters of negative cognitions that are specifically organized around guilt and responsibility. They sound like this: I should have known better, I should have done something, I did something wrong, I should have protected myself or them, it's my fault, I'm responsible. The person knows cognitively that it wasn't their fault. They can't say the words, but the body, the nervous system, the emotional memory, it keeps returning the same verdict: you should have done something. This is because traumatic memories are not processed the same way ordinary memories are. Ordinary memories become integrated. They lose their emotional charge over time. They get filled into narrative. They become something that happened rather than something that is still happening. Traumatic memories, when they are not processed, remain in a kind of frozen state, still carrying their original emotional weight. And the meaning that was made in the moment of the trauma, including guilt, stays attached. This is also how guilt becomes a pathway into anxiety and depression. When you carry the belief, I should have known better, or I'm responsible for what happened, this belief does not stay contained to one memory. It generalizes. It becomes a lens. You start monitoring for situations in which you might miss something, fall short. This monitoring becomes chronic hypervigilance and turns into anxiety. And when the gap between what you believe you should be able to do and what you actually can do becomes unbridgeable, when the verdict against yourself feels final and permanent, that can turn into depression. Guilt in this way is not just an emotion. It is a way of organizing your relationship to yourself, to others, to your own needs, that makes genuine rest, genuine self-compassion, genuine ease almost neurologically impossible. Because how can you rest when you believe there is something you should be doing, should have done, should have prevented? There is one more dimension of this I want to name because I see it constantly in clinical work, and I think it explains a great deal of the exhaustion that people carry. Many people who struggle with chronic irrational guilt have also from early in life learned to be containers for other people's emotions. What do I mean by container? I mean that in certain families, certain relationships, certain emotional environments, there is one person, often a child, often a particular child, who becomes the designated holder of the emotional weight of the system. The one who senses when things are about to go wrong, the one who monitors the emotional temperature of the room, the one who adjusts their own feelings, their own needs, their own truth in order to stabilize someone else. So the most experiential level, it feels like this. You're always tracking how other people feel. Your own emotional state is secondary, almost an afterthought. Other people's pain, anger, disappointment lands in your body as if it's your responsibility. And guilt is the enforcement mechanism. If you sense that someone is unhappy, your guilt activates, even if their unhappiness has nothing to do with you. If you say no to something, guilt arrives to punish you, but it's exhausting. And it's hard to explain for someone who hasn't lived it, because the exhaustion isn't just physical, it is the exhaustion of never being in your own experience, of always being in someone else's. Not always, but most of the time. What I want to offer is this. First of all, separate the signal from the noise. When guilt arrives, the question is not, how do I make this feeling stop? No, the question is, what is this guilt actually about? Is it pointing to something I genuinely did? Something that is within my control and responsibility? So you must be honest with yourself. And it's like a compassionate audit, not self-attack, because then shame is entering. But genuine reflection. Did I harm someone? Is there something real to repair here? If yes, repair it. Then guilt will ease. If the answer is no, if the guilt is attached to something you didn't do, couldn't have done, weren't responsible for, then the work is different. The work is recognizing that this guilt is old. It learned something once under specific conditions about your responsibility for the emotional world around you. And it is applying that learning everywhere. Second, trace the belief. Every guilt has a belief underneath it. I should have known better. I should have protected them. It's my job to make sure everyone is okay. These beliefs feel like moral facts, but they're not. They are cognitive structures that formed in a specific context. They can be questioned. Please question them and try to update them if they don't work anymore. Third, allow yourself to be finite. One of the deepest sources of irrational guilt is the implicit belief that you have unlimited capacity, that you could have done more, known more, given more. If only you had tried harder or been more attentive, things would have been different. But you're human, you have limits. You're working with what you have, and you've been working with what you had in that context. So you need to allow yourself to be ordinary human. Then notice the pattern of containment. If you recognize yourself in the description of someone who carries other people's emotions, take that seriously. You don't need to feel guilty about it, but just take it as information. Notice whose feelings you're holding right now. Notice whether your own emotional experience is accessible to you. Notice what happens in your body when you consider putting something down. You're allowed to have your own interior life, especially if no one modeled that for you. Guilt is not your enemy. Our emotions are not our enemies in general. Even when they're irrational and cause us, discomfort, even when they're telling us things that are not true, even when they are running the show in ways that have cost you in rest, in ease, in your relationships with yourself and others. Guilt is trying to do something. In its healthiest form, it is trying to keep you connected to your values and to the people you love. In its distorted form, it is trying to protect you from something. Abandonment, maybe destruction of the system you were part of, maybe unbearable experience of not being able to control what happened to you or other people. So guilt is not lying maliciously. It learned something and it kept applying it. But you can stop it. What it needs is understanding. Your understanding and acceptance, acknowledgement that it came from somewhere, that it made sense in the past, and that you are now old enough, resourced enough to begin to question whether it is still serving you. That is the beginning of a different relationship with guilt. I'm not saying guilt-free, it's not the goal. It is not even possible if you have moral compass, but guilt with discernment. Ability to hear the signal, assess where it's accurate, and respond accordingly. That is practice. And it starts with understanding what you are actually dealing with. So in the next video, we're going to take everything we've built here and apply it to one very specific place where irrational guilt shows up constantly and where it does tremendous harm. I'm talking about rest. why you feel guilty when you stop, what it means to actually allow yourself to recover without needing to earn it. I hope you watch it, and I'll see you there.